Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Claire. I'm a contract librarian on assignment here with NOAA Central Library. This seminar series is offered through the NOAA Central Library Seminar Program, which provides an educational forum for the presentation of ideas, research updates, and news in support of NOAA's mission. Before we start, I have a few technical tips for attendees. Just so you are aware, you are muted and you are not able to unmute. However, if you have a question, you can type it into the question panel and we will stop for questions throughout the presentation and during the Q&A session at the end. If you're having any audio or visual issues, if you can't hear the speaker or see the slides, please try logging off and logging back on, and that will solve most issues with GoToWebinar. And as a reminder, this is being recorded. If you would like to revisit this seminar or view previous seminars, you can find them on our YouTube channel. Now I'm going to turn it over to Fiona, who's going to introduce our speakers today.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is sort of like a special webinar that we're running. It is not our typical fireside chat, but I want to give you a little bit of background. In February 2022, OER and NOS hosted a leadership summit to advance collaboration and identify the opportunities and means of increased partnerships between OER and NOS for specific topics. And one of the four major topics was, of course, R2X, or research and development transitions into operations, commercialization, and other uses. And one of the actions from that summit, particularly on the session on R2X, is to further incorporate the social science component in our cross-line office transition activities and framework, and also transition plans. So today's seminar is to share how NOAA is using project management tools in transition plans into the R2X framework. In particular, highlighting recommendations and best practices for transitioning social science research by emphasizing knowledge transfer and nurturing trust between researchers and operational practitioners. So I'm now going to introduce our guest speakers. Dr. Gina Eosco is a social scientist and risk communication expert, managing NOAA's Weather Program Office's Social Science and Forecasting a Continuum of Environmental Threats, that's the FACETS programs. Nina's focus is on prioritizing social and behavioral science. I see you're referring to that as SBS, research needs within the weather community, determining ways to translate social science research into applications, learning from operational meteorologists and practitioners to understand the next research challenge. Dr. Castle-Williams is a contractor supporting Gina and the WPO Social Science Program and the Social Science R2X Coordinator. Castle brings a wealth of knowledge, excitement, and enthusiasm to the R2X process, and more importantly, aims to improve the process for principal investigators that wish to translate and transition social science research into various NOAA applications. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Gina and Castle.
Thank you so much. What a welcome. And it's really lovely for both of us to be here today. As Fiona says, I'm Gina Eosco. I am the Social Science Program Manager for the Weather Program Office. And even prior to that position, was really dedicated to thinking about research to applications in this space as well. And Castle, would you like to say any more as well?
Sure. I think Fiona did it really well, but I am a contractor supporting Gina in the Weather Program Office in the kind of the social science research application space. And I was a previous principal investigator myself, so I have a lot of experience of actually going through the transition process myself. That really excites me about this topic.
I'm sorry, I just want to add one more thing. I want to acknowledge my co-collaborator here is Lonnie Gonzalez. Lonnie is the, whereas I'm the OER representative, Lonnie is the Ocean Service representative, and you probably saw him up on the screen earlier. And he and I have been strategizing on ways to be responsive to the NOS OER Leadership Summit. And so I'm going to hand it back over to you. Thank you, Lonnie.
Awesome, and thank you to you both for this platform. And of course, we welcome your questions. Hopefully, this presentation is helping to answer some of the gaps that people and some of the questions people may have as it relates to social science transitions. We know this is virtual. We know it's a webinar. You know that you can see us, but we can't see you. So Castle and I, our style is very interactive, so we actually will have little stop signs at particular points where we'd love to get your questions at that stage of the presentation rather than only waiting towards the end, although we welcome questions at the end as well. So our style is interactive, so please, again, add your questions as you have them. We are going to share our reflections and stories. We're going to try to be a little bit back and forth so this doesn't feel so pre-planned. And we're going to sort of tell you how we think about social science R2O, but also how we social scienced R2O. We love to use social science both as a topic and as a verb. And I think that's really important. We really tried to put the role of humans in transitions, and I'm sure that's not surprising given that we are social scientists. So next slide, please. So back in 2019, a report followed in 2020 that you can see on the slide, and we do have QR codes, so if you do have your phone there, you can get that report from the NOAA Central Library Institutional Repository. We hosted a weather-focused social science research to operations workshop, and we received some hard to hear constructive criticisms. At the time, we really hadn't done, our team had not done transition plans. And so some of the feedback was how social science was fitting in other programs in other ways, and how that transition plan process that was, tested more on physical science projects, how it worked or not with social science. What I'll also say, and of course you can read some of the quotes in the slide, the audience at this workshop wasn't just social scientists. We actually had a lot of physical science representation at the workshop as well. So what is on this slide is really representative of an interdisciplinary perspective on the transition plan process. And you can see some of the adjectives. They are hard to hear. The current transition process is complex, rigorous, and jarring. Jarring is not a word that makes me have warm fuzzies, right? This was not a straightforward process, right? And Castle, I think as a PI, you probably felt that yourself, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was there and as a participant, and I witnessed hearing the word jarring, and I think it really resonated with me, honestly, because that's how it really felt. It felt really isolated in trying to complete that transition process, especially in developing the transition plan. So definitely a lot of the adjectives they're using, I really resonated with.
Yeah, and that's troubling, right? And so we heard this feedback and we said we got to keep teasing this out of the workshop. And what we then heard was some really productive recommendations. Things like, for social science, we need to expand the phrase research to operations, and we'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. The need to better transfer scientific knowledge into operations, not just things, but things and knowledge. This will be a repetitive theme from us. And emphasizing the agile and evolving nature of transition plan policies and practices. The policies say it's agile, the policies say it'll evolve, but sometimes the way that we project manage these doesn't communicate that agile process to our PIs. Next slide, please. So here are some of the additional findings from the R2O workshop report. And maybe I'll pick one here that kind of stood out to me, and then Castle, you can do the same. We're not going to go over every single one. But again, this sort of idea that transition plans must be able to change as the project evolves. And one of the reasons for this actually had to do with social science, scientific integrity. What do I mean by that? Well, if you already know a predetermined output of your project at the beginning, does that really jive with social science, right? Social science research, you may have an end goal of enhancing a product. That might be a goal that's tangible. But do you know exactly how you're going to change that product? Well, no, you should have the data speak for those results. So social scientists communicated to us at the workshop that they really didn't like writing the transition plan too early, because they wanted to kind of write a skeleton within the first 6 to 12 months and then be able to insert the data and results from their project over time. So the agility and the evolution of a transition plan became really critically important to social science researchers. And that was something that we've really taken to heart. Castle, what was something that kind of jumps out to you?
Yeah, and this is kind of a clue to stuff we'll talk about later on in the talk, but I think readiness levels were a big topic of discussion at the workshop. And from someone that experienced them in particular, it felt like I was the one that, as a principal investigator, that had to kind of argue or provide evidence of why I was at a specific readiness level. And it was hard because I didn't really understand them, especially when it came to thinking about them in terms of social science research. So there were a lot of difficulties thinking through the readiness levels in terms of social science research. And you'll see a little bit further with some of our thinking, but it doesn't necessarily need a whole new scale for social science. It's just trying to think through what are the different stages of that research and how do we move through, or as you'll see later, maybe jump through different levels of the readiness stages.
Yeah, we will talk quite a bit about readiness levels. One of the last ones I want to stop on, again, there's so many different components here, is projects with end users may have more than one operational output. And this was an amazing finding. It's so obvious, but it's been really interesting how much pushback we sometimes receive inside the agency. Well, no, you need to have one primary output. I'm going, well, but why? Why do we only need one? What if there really are two really great ones? You know, why must we focus on one? And so one of the things we are trying to do is adapt to that and make sure that we're documenting not just one use, one output, but the many, right? The diverse applications of social science. And we'll talk about some of those outputs as well. Next slide, please. And I promise we'll stop in a moment in case there are questions. So what we did is we took all this feedback that is in this very long report. We welcome you to read it and let us know what you think. We're always welcome to more feedback and constructive criticisms. We took that workshop report and said, we're going to turn this into goals for our program that you see here on this slide. So since 2020, we've been trying to make the transition plan development process more collaborative, make transition plan development more iterative, flexible, and agile by using a lot of very cool tools, which Castle has really championed in our program. Optimize transition plan development to reduce burden for all. At the end of the day, I'm not funding a project just to make a transition plan. I'm funding the project, right? And so we have to have a good balance here of allowing the PI to focus on the doing of the project and not just the transition plan. So, and yet it's really important. We believe in transition plans. So how do we balance that burden of that process and make it less jarring? Remember, now we have goals. We want new adjectives for our process, and explore transition opportunities both inside and outside NOAA. And so we will be talking a bit about these goals throughout the presentation. But let me stop here. I can see the question. I'm not sure if there are. Claire, let me check in. Were there any questions that have come in thus far?
We just had someone ask for the report, so there is a link to that in the chat for everyone now. You should all be able to see that. And let me see, another one just came through. Just a moment. Okay, it looks like a comment. It says, in our recent transition, not as social science R to X, but still, I recall the transition plan signing process, 3 levels of signatures required at each of the originating and receiving offices, was so arduous and above my pay grade that the TP itself seemed set in stone and not a living, evolving document that any actual transition requires.
Yes.
Yes.
And so all we'll say is we agree. So, well, let me add to that. We appreciate why the signatures are necessary and for awareness, because one of the reasons to have a transition plan is to make people aware of this amazing output that's stemming from this great research. If no one is aware of it, right, then this research doesn't have any utility. So transition plans have a role in this process, and those signatures are part of that process of saying, I've read it, I'm aware of possible applications in the future. For that reason, we totally get it and we appreciate it. But we also are part of that signature process and have to track that. And so what we say is we empathize with you on that process, and we are working towards, with our transition plans, helping to streamline that with our partners on both sides, obviously following the NOAA policies. So we definitely empathize with any of you who feel the same way. Okay, great, and great feedback. These are great comments. So let's continue. And Castle, I think you've got the next slide.
Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, so I think the question that we just had was a really great transition to what we're going to talk about. And this is really the first big chapter of our talk, and one of the main takeaways that we really want those watching to walk away with. So we really found and have this kind of idea, especially through a lot of my experiences being a PI, is that we really have to strike a delicate balance between overburdening our principal investigators or our researchers with the transition process, while still including and empowering them with transition knowledge to develop relevant and applicable research outputs. So this is really interesting in the sense of that balance is really hard, and Gina kind of elaborated on this a little bit, but we can't give them too many things to kind of get in their way of actually doing their research, which is usually their main priority and their goal. But at the same point, we have to give them certain nuggets to help them get that transition knowledge to really understand how the thing that they're going to kind of provide or create is going to be applicable to that adopter. So it's really this delicate balance, and we're not saying we have that figured out. We just recognize that there is a really delicate balance. And so we'll walk through some of the things that we kind of do in order to walk or try to walk that line a little bit. So next slide. So with this slide, I'm going to toss it to Gina in a second, but when we think about these research outputs, these are some of the really big ones that come up. And so we often
Have we lost Castle?
Yeah, I was just about to ask. I lost him, but I wasn't sure if it was everyone.
I've lost him.
Castle, can we try 1, 2, 3 here? Did we lose you? All right, I'm gonna pick up. I'm gonna try to channel what he said, pick up. He's gonna rejoin here in just a second. Sorry, occasionally we do have some Google Meet sound issues, and it looks like it transferred over, no problem. What Castle was saying is that one of the ways that we help think about outputs is by putting them in categories. It just helps because it allows us to create templates and ideas for different tracks for different outputs that have been created. And one way that we've thought about this is to start with what we've been good at so far. A lot of our transition plans have focused on technology. And indeed, social science can influence technology as well, right? We're not immune from that. And so you see that technology does play prominently here as well. One of the things that we found out from our workshop in 2019, though, is that people felt like the emphasis on technology was actually devoid of knowledge. That is to say, the transition plan is just a document. Technology is just a thing. Again, being a social scientist, people use technology. A person still needs to transfer that technology. A person still needs to know to understand what to do with that technology. And so what we've found in talking to a lot of our physical science counterparts is that knowledge transfer was missing as an output in technology transfer. Technically, they should be married together in the same plan. So what we've done is say, well, maybe knowledge transfer is embedded in a tech transfer, in a transition plan, and also for social science, knowledge transfer may be the primary output, right? The idea that we often use research to operations in the weather domain, but operations often has this very narrow focus, rightfully so, of 24/7, 365 operations of forecast information. Indeed, that's really, really important. And indeed, a lot of our projects do influence that space. But what's more is that social science applications can also impact the policies, people, and processes that surround that 24/7 environment. That is to say, there could be knowledge to influence product development, but it's not in the product suite yet. So you need to help influence the policy sphere. We're not saying the PI will influence the policy sphere. What we're saying is the knowledge may be used by a recipient for a policy application. Another aspect is transferring methods. Lots of people across the agency want to collect user needs or understand requirements, right? That stakeholder engagement is done across the agency. Maybe researchers could help create really solid mechanisms for surveys and transfer a method to NOAA to help enable that. And then data has become another really huge output for social science. That is to say, we have an amazing mission within the weather domain to save lives, protect property, and enhance the national economy. But we know indeed we do explicitly. It's very hard to measure without data. And so data now has become an output as well. Castle, I think I channeled you here to try to fill in the gaps. I hope that I did, but just want to test, can we hear your audio?
Testing my audio.
We are good. Okay, welcome back. Happy to have you. And we're good. We've gone over all four, and we'll just jump in and continue.
Perfect. Next slide then. Awesome. So Gina provided a really nice overview. I believe I wasn't around, but I know she did. So here are just some examples, and I don't want to go through all of these because it's a lot of information on this slide, but we really wanted to provide a lot of good kind of concrete things when it comes to how we're thinking about some of these research outputs, because we can have these big umbrella terms like knowledge and data, but when it comes down to it, it's important that we kind of articulate what that looks like. And again, trying to work that balance with the principal investigators of like, what does some of this transition look like? So just as an example, you can see in the top left-hand corner, those are about knowledge. So here we might create or find some research-guided recommendations from the principal investigators that might have an implication on changing a policy, product, or service. We can also transfer knowledge about a technology. So I think Gina has already been emphasizing the importance of both physical and social science knowledge transfer. So that can be important, especially in the technological realm. In terms of data, we're finding a lot of value in being able to measure mission, impact, and change. So being able to provide that data to an operational entity like the Weather Service, that they can then kind of longitudinally or over time be able to look at how are their products and services changing, or how is their mission changing based on some of the new additions or advancements that they're providing. And then in the top right-hand corner, we can talk about those methodologies that Gina just highlighted. Are there ways for us to collect vulnerability data from our partners, and ways that we can kind of, researchers can create those methods and then embed them within the Weather Service like WFOs in order to collect data from their partners in order to make some of their products and services more instinctive to some of those vulnerabilities. So next slide.
So you might be waiting for this beloved readiness levels, right? Some of you probably love them, and I'm betting there are some people who are on the opposite end of the spectrum. We like them. We're going to put ourselves in the middle. We like them. They have utility. You can advance the slide. Transition readiness levels are a tool in our toolbox. That's the way we think about it. They are a systematic way to measure where the maturity of R&D projects. And it helps us understand when we look at a portfolio of research within our program, what have we funded the last few years? Where are they? Are they all early concept and therefore we don't have anything to transition? Or do we have projects that cross the spectrum? And almost undoubtedly, we have things that cross the readiness level spectrum. But they're a tool in the toolbox. We use them in a variety of ways. We use them again to assess that maturity, to compare, to meet our mission, because again, if we only had early concept projects and we were never transitioning, then we wouldn't be seeing the value of our R&D, right? So you need a broad spectrum of projects across these readiness levels. So we like them. Should we involve PIs with readiness levels? We have a complicated answer. Yes and no. And it's based on feedback. It's based on stakeholder feedback. And so with that, we'll go to the next slide. And Castle, what is some of that feedback that we've received? Because it's not all warm and fuzzy.
It's not, and oftentimes it's not even negative feedback. It's more of like confusion or just kind of misunderstanding of what their role is in kind of evaluating or providing those readiness levels. And so on the screen here, you can see like 4 big topic areas of some of these misconceptions that exist. One being, are readiness levels even applicable to social science research? We hear that question often, and our answer is yes. And we'll provide a little bit more of information on that in the next slide. There are other ones like, am I expected to move through all of the readiness levels during my project period? There sometimes feel like those expectations exist, but we're trying as a program to limit those, reduce those, and really acknowledge that you have to think about the project and the funding that you're provided in a 2-year period. Oftentimes it's not even like substantial in order to be able to like traverse the entire readiness level spectrum. So being really cognizant of the expectations that we're putting on our researchers is a really important thing we're trying to emphasize in our program. And the other thing is kind of thinking about the success and how researchers evaluate or use the readiness level as a metric of success. And so we're trying to reduce the stigma that if people move up or down in readiness levels throughout their project, it's not a sign of like you're being unsuccessful or you've received like a C grade on a paper or something like that. It's just our way of identifying how ready it is for transition. That does not necessarily mean that it's a negative thing or it's a bad thing at all. It's just how we're evaluating how much more research and development may be needed, but also like, is the physical science even ready for what you are creating? Perhaps we need to go back in time in order to help the physical science catch up to where you're actually at. And this last one I think is pretty fun, and I think I'll throw it to Gina first. She has a really good example of using Mario to think about some of the readiness levels, and if we have to actually move through them one at a time. So Gina, what are your thoughts on that?
I am a big fan of Mario. That probably shows my age, but if you remember like the Super Nintendo, and if you remember, you could get through, like if you got to World 3, there was a cannon, and like World 3 that brought you to World 8, something like that. And that idea that you can jump readiness levels, you can jump Mario worlds, it's kind of the same idea, right? For social science, really for any project, but it really just depends on whether you need to go through each individual step. The idea is that if you're developing an early concept research project, but you develop a method in that process, again, think multiple outputs, and you validate that in a social science way. See, this is why these terms are really interesting in the readiness levels. If you provide a very valid and reliable survey mechanism, the knowledge that you're testing still needs more advancement. Maybe it needs a larger sample size or needs to be tested with more audiences. But you believe that the survey methodology is incredibly sound. That could jump for an RL3 to a 9. Someone could use that survey if you were to say publish your instrument, get a DOI, right? So you can get attribution for that. Someone could use that. So it's much the same way as that Mario world. You're not expected to go through each individual one if it's not applicable to your project. So we strongly believe that the context of your project, the context of the transition space, the operational or the application space has to be factored in. And so I really love what Castle said. I think the more that we've integrated readiness levels into proposal processes, it's given PIs a lot of anxiety. And what we're trying to say is, no, it's a tool. It is a tool, at least from our perspective, the way we think about it for social science. It is a tool to assess how your research may fit in and plug and play within that operational framework. We do not expect you to have all of that information. And that's why we feel our role is sort of like a facilitator, or sometimes we say an R2O therapist. And we're not making light of therapy. I'm a big fan of therapy, but this is a lot like therapy. You have multiple parties. They're not all thinking the same way. You kind of need someone to mediate between the two. We don't use that analogy lightly. Sometimes you do need to kind of go back and forth and build that understanding. And I'm kind of teasing that because that's a big part of our later slides. Next slide, please. So how do we think about those readiness levels? There's no right or really wrong way to think about them. This is the way that we've sort of thought about social science as it relates to the readiness levels. And really, when you look at the physical science RLs and you bring it in this environment, we didn't change any of the definitions of the RLs. What we did was change sort of underlying how we think about it. And that is to say, basic research is more theoretical research. If you're applying your research within the context of NOAA, you're starting at an RL2. So theory and application always work together. A proof of concept is you're trying something, it might be a small sample size. So it could be a case study, a pilot study, something that's small. But at the same time, what if you're testing a product that's already been in existence? We have a huge audience that already has experience with that. You're not at a proof of concept, right? Or maybe your method is at a proof of concept, but your product is way further along, right? This is what makes this very tricky. And so the way we've thought about this is sort of increasing generalizability or ecological validity, trying to give a call up here to both quantitative and qualitative work, because we know that there's a variety of methods used in social science, and so generalizability isn't always the right concept. But that is to say that as you get higher in the RLs, you have a stronger sense of evidence from what you're studying that your results are sound, valid, reliable. that they can stand on their own to influence an operational decision to say, change a product, change a policy, right? You want strong enough evidence. And so we've sort of thought about this as that increasing generalizability. If you're transferring a method, it may mean you've tested that method. Let's say there are some really great projects that are transferring methods for how to collect data from emergency managers and map them. One that comes to mind is Jack Friedman's work on the brief vulnerability overview tool. They have some active projects where they are working on transitioning methodologies. And they're testing it with a few WFOs, and maybe at a later time, we might want to advance it to a larger number of WFOs and see how it runs on its own, right? And so our team has sort of helped apply those readiness levels. Again, is it one size fits all? Absolutely not. Do we often sort of negotiate the space of what RL it is? Absolutely we do. So let me just stop here and see. I don't see any blinking questions, but Claire, I just want to double check. Are there any questions coming in as it relates to social science and readiness levels?
Yes, we did have a question come in. This is a two-part question. Let me know if you need me to repeat it. I've never heard of a project moving backwards in readiness levels. Can you provide an example or scenario for that? And does no movement in readiness levels indicate unsuccessful progress?
Oh, that's such a great question. None of it conveys a lack of success from where I sit. I would need more context on it. But from our perspective, you might do a project where you make your survey and you've collected a lot of results, and we go over them and we go, wow, this was really tricky. This was a tricky context to study. One that comes to mind is a team working on a winter weather survey. Oh my gosh, they've done a dynamite job, just dynamite. But winter weather is just so tricky to get feedback from the public. And so trying to understand the products was really tricky. And so the survey was great, the data is great, but also we went back and looked at some of the wording and the results and going, you know, but I interpreted this question differently. I'm not sure, you know, we might want to go back and retest some of those survey questions and see if those are the right measures for that particular variable. The whole team was very receptive to that and going, yeah, like this ended up being much harder than we thought it was to get those perceptions of winter weather right in the wording. And so maybe we didn't advance in RL, but we advanced our knowledge. I don't see that as a lot. That is success to me. I never want to force a research team to advance for the sake of advancing. If the science is telling us this is really hard, we need to do more research and development on this, well, then that's what the science says. Scientific integrity needs to come first in this matter. I don't want to rush to put a survey into operations for some reason, right? If it hasn't been sort of peer reviewed, and not even just peer reviewed, but the team that's creating it is still going, we have to iterate on this, right? And so no, lack of movement on an RL from where I sit is not a lack of success. The first question was an example of one that has gone down. And Castle, you've been looking at the transition plans more recently. Do you have an example?
Yeah, I almost wonder if the example you just gave could be an example of it moving down. So in theory, the first iteration could have been a proof of concept that maybe didn't work out as well. And so they may have needed to go back to that applied research stage, maybe review some previous studies, additional literature to really get the question wording down before they then do a resampling of it. So I think another aspect of this that we need to highlight is that I don't think we're like being very strict about going up and down readiness levels. So it's not something that we kind of monitor frequently. It's more of on the lines of how are things progressing, not trying to point that out. And so I think in your example, it theoretically could have moved back a readiness level, but I don't think it's something that as a program we would point that out to the researcher. So again, trying to draw the lines and the bounds between the readiness levels being useful for us and understanding where that project is at and along the R&D spectrum, but not kind of making the PI feel as though they're being dragged along for every single iteration or thing that we're talking about in terms of this metric, because it's one that we frequently use ourselves versus the PI really needing to focus a lot on it. We want them focusing on the research.
Exactly. Some people think, you know, 1 year, 1 RL, not in our world. That's not how we feel. Sometimes you need to sit on RL5. Sometimes you just need to sit there for a couple of years And again, it's because of this balance of research, the technology development that may need to coexist with that social science research. There might be co-production of a technology, for example, the physical science research that again needs to play there, and the operational viability. All of those different pieces may advance at a different rate. I mean, sometimes I think of readiness levels as a ladder, where one side of the ladder is the research RL and the other is the operation, and the steps need to work together. And so you can't have a step that's on an angle. That would be a very broken step, right? So it's sort of like the research might be advancing faster than operations can receive it. And if that's the case, we've got to decrease it. But that is not a reflection. It's not a reflection on performance of the researcher. And frankly, it's not even a reflection on the performance of operations. It's a tool for us to assess, okay, we need to get operations a little bit more ready, right? We need to work with our operational partners before we do that. And that's why collaborations and partnerships are so key in this process. This is a fantastic question. Thank you for those. I think you're the audience, you're adding so much value to our presentation, so thank you. I'm sure there are more questions. For the sake of time, we're going to jump into chapter 2 here. And let me I am now off on my slide deck here. Yes, it is me. Okay. So one of the things that we want to emphasize to everyone is that the way we think about transition plans is not one project, one transition plan. That may be how we need to do it in action. So every project does have a transition plan, but that's not our philosophy inside our program. We treat our PIs and their projects as a cohort, which provides benefits for the transition process while also creating a virtual space for social science researchers to feel connected with like-minded individuals. This concept of a cohort is really, really important. It's become a critical part of our program. Next slide, please. And I want to tell you a little bit about why we've thought about this. So I'm going to tie it back to those readiness levels. This is my sort of cartoonish version of describing some of the challenges that I see with readiness levels. I was a researcher before I came into this position. And when you're a researcher, you're at RL2. You're combining theory and application. You love the applications in NOAA, and you do a research project. And what happens at the end of a research project? Come on, we all know it, right? The next research questions, right? Because every research project has more research questions. And so that's what we're trained to do as researchers. And so you might be what I call our RL2 researchers. And we need to champion those people because they're amazing. They have such strengths to theory and application. But those people, they're going to keep asking more research questions, right? They may or may not, it depends. There's a spectrum here. They may or may not have a real deep interest in wanting to understand, well, how do I take the knowledge of my project and move it into that development or demonstration phase of transition into NOAA, right? They may or may not. And so I sort of jokingly say, well, you got to know a transition team then. There are also amazing social science researchers that I would actually call them transition researchers. They are people that love the theory and application and partner so well with the RL2 researchers, but they have such a deep love for the application that they're working in that they've worked really hard to make those connections to NOAA and the application with practitioners, either within NOAA or to the broader community, such as water managers, emergency managers, right? And so there are those transition team people. And then when you start getting up into those middle RLs, it's like, well, and also, you need to also have expertise in programming, by the way, in weather service software programming, not other programming, specific to weather service. Hope you have that knowledge too, right? Also, it might be nice for you to have an engineering background, a data science background. You get the gist, right? I'm kind of mocking it, right? But my point is, it's very simple. It is almost impossible for one person, for one project team to have expertise that traverses RL 1 through 9. It's just impossible to have all of that knowledge. And so what we've seen and what we want to convey to you all is that sometimes your teams need to grow or they change as a project continues. It may not be the same PIs. It may be different people with different strengths. Or as you get to middle RLs, your team may need to be balanced between researchers and operational collaborators that may have some of that inside knowledge, right? That's the point here. And when you look at this then, when I look at this RLs and I think of it as I see this and I see, oh my gosh, we need so many different experts. I go, one project, one transition is not the way to think about science transitions. Definitely not social science transitions. I think of it as a suite of research. A suite of research influences a transition. It's not always one-to-one. Next slide, please. So this started a few years ago in our program. We had an opportunity with hurricane supplemental funding in fiscal year 18 to pilot this particular approach. And I have to say, at the time, I'm not sure we knew what we were piloting. We built 4 major projects, and we built them with this idea that these projects would be very complementary. There were purposeful overlaps and purposeful differences among the 4 projects. And we thought this is an opportunity for us to build a collective body of research with these 4 projects. And what we found was that instead of thinking as each of the 4 projects as one project, one transition, what we actually pitched in our large project plan was it was 4 projects, one transition plan. And that we, in this particular case, this was a different kind of project, we WPO would write the transition plan. We were going to triangulate the results of the 4 projects. We are actually in that process right now, believe it or not, 4 years later. Takes a long time. We now have 3 out of the 4 projects that are complete, 1 that we're waiting for. We are triangulating, reading through all the reports, translating those findings into applications to NOAA. And so we found it very productive to think of it as a suite of research into transition. And what we found in this process was there were unexpected benefits, and not just to us. We found that the PIs loved it. They didn't feel alone. They felt like they had a team of people that they could lean on. In some cases, they met new people, or they said, I've always wanted to work with that PI, but I never had an opportunity. And so they met new colleagues in this process. Then, without any guidance from us, they started sharing data and collection instruments. They started reaching out to one another, sharing, hey, do you mind if I add your scale to our survey that we could share the data? They started confiding in one another, asking research questions. There were so many benefits to this, we were actually floored. And it was sort of by accident. We didn't necessarily design it from that perspective. After seeing this, we thought, gee, I wonder if this would work with our competition projects as well. And so we decided to pilot this further with our fiscal year 21 projects to see if the benefits continued in other applications. Next slide, please. So for this, I'm going to transfer it a little bit to Castle, because this starts getting into some of the project management tools we had. What I will say is what we've done is we had 10 funded projects. And what we do is we create these informal sessions. Yes, we still have progress reporting sessions where people have to report out on their projects, but we also have these things called cohort sharing sessions. And they've been incredibly meaningful. People have debriefed their field work, not necessarily the findings, but how they are feeling. Field work is hard, especially post-disaster. We've shed tears together. We've heard about marriages, babies. We've heard about people's lives. Again, sort of that sharing of personal space. But again, what we found, people are sharing instruments, samples. People found out about different partners, mechanisms. What it did was it just increased the function of the research. They had a team of people they could lean on. What's more is that we brought in the operational points of contact for transitions, and they are learning about social science and sharing knowledge. And so as this continues to grow, I'm sure we'll find other unexpected benefits that we've yet to see. But Castle, explain a little bit about the tools, because this will play into the next section as well.
Yeah, and I'll just also add that it was nice to see people's walls start to come down too with this cohort approach, as we often see there's this kind of embedded competition between researchers, and this space I think is really nurturing that peer-to-peer relationship really well. But yeah, that leads well into the Smartsheet portal that we created. And so as a previous principal investigator myself, I always struggled with like trying to find the right document or the right template or the right thing to provide to NOAA when it was time to provide some sort of review. So I wanted to create a central hub for all of these different types of documents, all these types of templates, just so that all the PIs could easily access them. But what we wanted to do was kind of combine the cohort approach idea with this central hub so that we could create kind of a network where people could better understand and learn about each of the other projects, so they can kind of cross-pollinate and learn and identify maybe, oh, there's this kind of connection to my project here. So what we did was we created these individual project dashboards that allow people to like visually explore each other's projects. And the other things that we did was we created kind of an old school forum. So if you remember like the old school days of being able to type a question and talk with someone, we created one of those so that our PIs could talk to one another, share those data collection instruments, and also just ask about how do you get in contact with this type of sample. As Gina mentioned, we've had a lot of discussions about ways to reach emergency managers. And I think without the cohort approach, we wouldn't be able to have this sort of interaction. So also conscious of the time, but I wanted to check in, Claire, if there was maybe like a quick question about this chapter before we move on.
Yeah, the question I have here is, the cohort approach seems to have worked with the disaster supplemental projects because there was a shared topic. Is this how it also worked with the FY21 projects? In other words, are cohorts organized by similar project topics?
Yeah, in this case, the 10 projects, were in response to some major science priorities in our funding call from fiscal year 21. They are not the same hazard. They're not the same audience. There are obviously overlaps with some projects. Some projects are focusing on public, some projects are focusing on forecasters or emergency managers, but they're not the same by design. We wanted to make sure that our funded projects do transcend a variety of areas. And so the types of topics that we share here are, best practices for methods or reaching out to different types of audiences, sharing those best practices, debriefing field work. We've talked about concerns and benefits of data publication, data and instrument publication. I should always put those two together. Data without the instrument isn't as useful in social science. You got to have both. And so, trying to talk about really, really big topics. We had a really passionate topic about whether someone should be in charge of who gets to go into the field and what type of organization should be in charge of that. And that was a very passionate discussion with no conclusion. That the idea was that we talked about, overlapping field work and trying to communicate when people were in the field when, so that people weren't competing or for that matter, oversampling the same set of users, for example, which is definitely of concern in social science. And also of concern is you don't want to, quote, control field research, right? So there's there's a need for balance in this. We've had a lot of discussions with Natural Hazard Center, who's had a lot of experience in this as well. So no, not the same subjects at all, very diverse projects.
I will say, however, that as we're starting to think about the translation stage, and that's kind of how we're seeing ourselves as that facilitator, we are seeing these larger themes emerge where there are kind of pockets of projects that will kind of triangulate nicely with one another. Even though they have there was no kind of connection whatsoever, we're starting to see some of these larger themes and how we might think of some of these individual cohort groups as that suite of research that we can think about in a transition perspective. Awesome, that was a great question. Next slide, please. I believe, Gina, I think this one's yours.
So chapter 3 is about emphasizing that the transition process is about collaborating and building a trusted relationship. An outcome of that collaboration is a transition plan. In other words, we flipped the model. The goal is to have a transition plan according to the policy. And we said, cool, we'll make that, but we're social scientists. So we're going to put the humans first. And we're going to focus on the collaboration and building a trusted relationship, because at the end of the day, that transition plan is a byproduct of discussions that occurred between a PI and a point of contact. And for that reason, what we've done is flipped our process for an emphasis on the collaboration and trusted relationship. And then beautifully, the plans are falling out of it. So Castle, I'm going to let you fly for the sake of time.
That sounds good. So next slide, please. So kind of the first thing we wanted to do was right out of the gate, we wanted to have the points of contact and the principal investigators meet. I think that's the most important, is for you to have like a one-on-one conversation to start really building some of those trusted relationships. So this meeting did not have any actions or goals. It wasn't, we need to develop a transition plan right now. It was, let's sit and talk and get to know one another. And that's really what it was about. We just asked the points of contact and the research team questions. We got them to better understand each other's point of view and perspective. And we also really helped establish collaboration roles, responsibilities, and expectations. And I think that was the most important thing out of these conversations, was that before we even jumped into the transition plan process, it was about understanding how people were going to collaborate and what each other's expectations were of one another. Next slide, please. So then after that collaboration initial meeting, we kind of moved into thinking about what the transition plan development stage might look like. And I've been working a lot with Smartsheet, and I saw a lot of really cool capabilities for potentially automating this process so that we could kind of essentially deal with the paperwork on the side and really, again, focus on the collaboration and building that trusted relationship. So the plan should, again, be an outcome or kind of should come from that relationship versus being the primary thing that we do this. And so we saw this as a really cool way to, the way we're envisioning it was a transition plan Mad Libs. So being able to pull and move around and pick out and select different things that would then be kind of auto-generated into Mad Libs. And so we saw really cool capabilities with Smartsheet to do this. So we came up with this process, and I'll go a little bit more into it on the next couple of slides. So next slide, please. So the first step was really about understanding previous transition plans and understanding what people had already put in them before, so that we could understand kind of like as a baseline, how are people thinking about some of the criteria and the different things that they put into transition plans. And so what I found was there were two things that really stood out to me. The first was this concept of acceptance criteria and how people were defining how a transition would be accepted. And what it really looked like was more of how like Weather Service reviewed or kind of identified some of these processes. And so we wanted to dive a bit deeper into that one. And then transition activities was often identical to these research milestones. And this was really, I don't want to say alarming to me, but it felt kind of as if it was not efficient to have two sections that were essentially identical. So thinking more about what does transition activities mean, and are there ways that we can break that out a little bit more? So what we did with the acceptance criteria was I was able to develop some canned responses based on previous transition plans that would give PIs and POCs something to react to versus having to sit there with a blank Word document that was just blinking and being intimidating in front of you. It was something for them to think about and react to versus having to develop or come up with themselves. And in addition to the transition activities, we also were able to break it out into both what a PI can bring to the table, but also what the points of contact should be bringing too. So those transition activities shouldn't be just research milestones on the research team side. We also need to be thinking, what do the points of contact need to do within their own line office to think through what are the things we have to do internally to get ready for something that might be ready to transition. So next slide. So what this really did was help us identify and create a facilitation guide. So as you can see, as Gina said, we are social sciencing this process by using social science methods throughout it. And you can see a picture of it on the right. But essentially what I did was I went through and mapped different relevant sections that were needed in a transition plan and created interview questions that we then facilitated with all of these PIs and POCs to get the information they needed out through those conversations versus having them to have to do it kind of in their own time. And you can see through these conversations, we've had both really positive feedback from PIs and POCs, they felt it was more smooth, collaborative, and less time intensive. And it was just really great in having us be able to facilitate that conversation, because we do have, our team has a lot of experience on both the research and operations sides. So we're able to kind of navigate some of those conversations a bit easier. Next slide, please. And so using those interview guides and the data essentially that we had collected from all the PIs and POCs, what we wanted to do was put that into Smartsheet and have it auto-generate a transition plan. Well, as things always happen, sometimes things are not ready yet for what they're doing. So the Smartsheet capabilities, unfortunately, are not ready yet. So if you're interested in the idea that I'm kind of looking more toward, there's a part of the Smartsheet called Document Builder that you should go take a look at. but essentially the Smartsheet capabilities weren't there. So what we ended up having to do was do it manually. But what really helped and what was beneficial was being able to walk through that process manually, because it helped us think, kind of reverse engineer what we would need in a future Smartsheet solution. So it really helped us think really clearly about how are the things that we're supposed to be doing and is it working well? Claire, if you'll click it one more time. And so through this manual process, we've been able to generate these transition plans. And we have a few that are done right now, but I'm really thankful and happy that we have an awesome team that really helped me fill in and kind of manually move over all the information we collected in those interviews. But it was a really great process, and we're looking forward to continue to refine it in the future. So next slide, please. And I'll really quickly say that, again, to really highlight that we're social sciencing this process. So Gina already mentioned the importance of collecting data. So what we're doing is throughout this entire research to operations or research to applications process, what we've done is we've generated a grantee customer satisfaction survey that we're providing to all of our principal investigators at 3 different time points. So when we did the kickoff meeting, at the end of year 1, and at the end of year 2, so that we can collect data through time to better understand how our principal investigators are feeling about the research to applications process, the transition development process, and if it's changing based on the things that we have done. So we ourselves are measuring change and impact on the policies and processes that we're putting into place. And I should also mention that feel free to reach out to us. You can use this because we've gone through OMB approval. So it's something that can be used should you be interested. And I'll let Gina finish things off with the final takeaways.
Yeah, next slide, please. The main takeaways, again, the main chapters of this conversation: strike a delicate balance between overburdening PIs while still including and empowering them throughout the process. We strongly suggest treating it like a cohort or a suite of research in whatever way your office or however it works if you're in NOAA for your research projects. That cohort idea just really provides a sense of community within the social science community that you are working with. And lastly, focus on the collaboration and building a trusted relationship as a first and primary point, and as a byproduct of that, as an outcome of that, a transition plan will become a much easier process and a much easier document to take away. I know this was like so much content to share, and so questions, any questions we can answer?
I'm going to pass it over to Claire and ask Claire if there are any questions. We have about 3 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes left.
Okay, so our next question is, how do you propose folks in the field implement a cohort approach? Are you available to provide support/guidance on a pilot cohort?
I think the first part of that, I'm not sure if that was from the community perspective or the NOAA perspective. Could you repeat the first part of that question?
Sure, the question was, how do you propose folks in the field implement a cohort approach?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, if you're in the field, you know, it might be trying to reach out to NOAA and find out if there are a group of compatible projects or something that could be grouped together within the funding program you're in. I would reach out to them to see if there is the compatibility for that. And certainly if you're in NOAA and want to try to do something the way we are, we're happy to provide some additional support and additional details on this presentation, and maybe do a longer session through the Social Science Committee within NOAA as well. Happy to provide support.
Okay, great. Another question here. Are the cohort-related transition plans accepted? In other words, is one transition plan outcome from 3 to 4 projects acceptable? How has this approach worked with leadership? Are they on board? Or is the desire still a one project, one plan approach?
That's a good question. So right now with the 10 projects, it is still one transition plan to one project. However, there are things sort of called umbrella transition plans. If projects have similarity in outcomes or types of transitions, you can group them to make that easier. My suggestion with that is just work very closely with your partners in the operational entity that you're transitioning to and discuss those ideas before you move forward. and that'll make the process efficient. Again, it always comes down to collaborate before you do. So in this case, the program that funds the project and the receiving office in the operational entity collaborate with them to understand what would be best to do. For the hurricane supplemental projects, we had more control over that. And so it was just sort of accepted that that's what we were going to do because the sub-project managers were both from OAR and Weather Service. So we were already collaborating on that.
So I want to thank, we're out of time now, but thank you so much to Gina and Castle, and thank you to my collaborator, Lonnie Gonzalez. And I want to say to everybody that in addition to Gina and Castle, you can reach out to ORTA, orta.research.noaa.gov, and we provide one-on-one support and also generally talk to Gina and Castle and other people in her office as well. So thank you all for attending. I'm hoping, Claire, you can compile the any remaining questions and send them to Gina and Castle. You can also send them to Francis Choi in my office, and we will work to hopefully identify people and get those questions sent out. So on behalf of Lonnie and myself, thank you again, Gina and Castle, and thank you, Claire, for all your support.
Not a problem. If you asked a question that was not answered during the presentation today, those will be forwarded. And I just want to say thank you to all of our speakers from the library. Thank you to all of the attendees for joining us. You will be able to find this presentation on YouTube later this afternoon. And when the presentation ends, you will see a survey. If you could take time to fill that out. We do use our surveys to improve marketing our library seminar service and to inform future seminar topics. Thank you all again for joining us and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.